Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 94. Tony and Loki, Alpha Part 2. Tony slung an arm around Salar's waist. He'd have preferred the shoulder, but that was rarely an option for usually tall people. Still, he had long practice in making this work. Bring the bags, would you? He tossed over his shoulder in Steve's direction, but if he befuddled one of the elves into doing it, so much the better. Sal and I have important things to talk about. Then he focused on the group around Salar and waved at the one closest to them. Be a good little minion and fetch us some food and wine, yeah. Then Tony shifted his weight and more or less forced Salar into moving. There were benefits to being short sometimes. Put him in a good position to shove the long, lanky swords out of their center of balance fairly easily. Especially when they were too busy staring at him in confusion to really protest his antics. And once he actually got them moving, 9 times out of 10, they didn't say a thing about it because it made them look like an idiot. Whining about the little guy bullying you into moving always did. So, Sal, I can call you Sal, right? Us being buds and all that. Tell me you're further along than them. Tony waved his free hand negligently, indicating the other realms. In gearing up, I swear, holding the hands of the Asgardians to get them moving might actually be necessary. You'd think a bunch of dumb muscle warmongers would be happier to get their ass-kicker boots on, you know? Step 2 in out-assholing a fellow asshole. Give them a better target than your own back. Something you apparently dislike too. A common target. And with the Asgardians apparently the next lowest man on the magical lineup after humans, Tony figured they were a good bet. Elves probably bitched about Asgardians the way most humans bitched about bugs. Besides, Odin was totally a legitimate target for every bit of assholery that got aimed his way, and a good-sized chunk of Asgard wasn't too much better. Frigga was a class act, but she wasn't exactly Asgardian. Speaking of, don't get me wrong, it's gotten better since Queen Frigga kicked that idiot to the curb. That woman has a grain of sense in her head, Tony said. But then that kind of figures. She's not Asgardian, so of course she's got sense. The rest of them... Tony gave a disappointed headshake. Less sense than a half-trained horse. The lot of them. There went Salar finding his feet. Tony could almost literally see the moment when Salar went from what is going on here to suddenly the world making sense again. Something I can complain about. I have always found Asgardians lacking in many departments, but I confess myself startled to find them reluctant to do battle. I know, right? Tony said, mentally apologizing to Thor for trash-talking his people. Bad enough they only have the one use, but to not want to be useful at all? Tony made a rude noise, and now that he had Salar engaged in both walking and talking, let go of him. Sure enough, Salar kept moving. Tony thought down the smug grin. Worked every time! Now we just had to keep Salar off balance enough to keep going with the flow and not thinking. Thinking led to going on the offensive. Couldn't have that. A yelling match might be fun, but there wasn't time for those sorts of matches. The faster he got Salar just confusedly nodding his head and agreeing, the better. So, anyway, Sal, I'm figuring you've got everybody armored up and ready to roll, am I right? I figure we can have you and your boys come to Earth first. I mean, you usually save the best for last, but I'm thinking the best are going to want to get a good look at things before the idiots and incompetents trample all over everything. Besides, if he got Salar and his group on Earth quick enough, Salar wouldn't have had time to realize just how badly he'd been bulldozed yet. I mean, for God's sake, we're going to have Nidavellir running around. It's going to be a mess, I'll tell you. But what can you do? I mean, we humans can probably kick Big Purple and Ugly's ass all on our own but everyone's insisting on being helpful. Tony put as much scorn as he possibly could on that last word. And I suppose being able to punch hard is a bit of a help, but really now, I'd much rather a more elegant solution. Loki's shtick is much more of a speed, and I figure you guys are even better than he is. Which, to that, even if some of these guys were more magically powerful, Loki was still 1,000 times better than they'd ever be because the guy had a brain in his head. About then, they got to what looked like a dining hall. Tony did a mental victory dance. Score! He managed to get Salar off balance enough that he'd gone with the food and drink thing rather than a formal meeting in the throne room, which was probably more normal for these bozos than chatting about strategy over a meal. Excellent! And that's when there was a scary moment because it was like seeing the dining room kick Salar's brain back into full gear. The look Tony got was mostly, "I am going to kill you slowly," for several long moments before something like amused condescension took over. While on the one hand, Tony was breathing a mental sigh of relief the guy had decided not to fry him, but that latter look? Yeah. No, he wasn't letting that stand. Because that was the sort of look you gave a pet when it did something halfway entertaining or clever. Before he could open his mouth, there was another sparkly flash of light. Tony had just enough time to note, and be amused by, the Pepto-Bismol pink color before he instinctively dodged. Unfortunately, whatever it was, it apparently had a homing beacon on it because it swerved with him and smacked. Well, not into him, that was for sure. About 3 inches in front of him, the pink spell collided with whatever spell Loki put in place, because like hell did that have anything to do with him. Everything got washed out in a white-blue glare. Then things got weird, because Tony felt a buzzing vibration centered straight in his reactor. And no, that didn't freak him out at all! And he was not only tasting, but smelling that weird coconut and metal thing that eventually becomes so much background noise after he gotten used to the new element in the reactor. Then there was a flare of blue-white light that shut out and knocked about 5 people on their butts. When Tony's field of vision finally cleared, everyone was looking rather startled. Everyone, including Loki. Which meant that some or all of that little show had not been his doing, which... What the crap? No, you know what? He'd deal with that later. Time to get back on the offensive. Like I said, Tony said, giving Salar a flat stare. You get one incident that causes the collapse of a few governments, and they never let you forget it. Salar got that bit between his teeth and visibly ran with it. The best part is that it wasn't even all that wrong. Tony had definitely destabilized a few governments in Asia Minor during his rampage against the Ten Rings. And he'd played a part, however minor, in the sequence of events that had led to Frigga giving Odin the boot. And he definitely wasn't opposed to actively kicking Sal to the curb if he got stubborn. And if Salar automatically assumed it would be a magical ass-kicking, that was his own prejudices at work. Loki was having to work to keep from laughing. Watching Tony at work was truly amazing. He was sorry he'd missed a bit of Tony's show before he convinced the elves to allow them to teleport to the castle. Tony had no way of knowing this, but just the fact that Salar was permitting physical contact was telling. The elves were rather physically standoffish, even among themselves. That Tony not only got close enough to initiate physical contact, but successfully initiated it, meant he had really befuddled Salar. Loki was fairly sure that about half the barbs aimed at Asgard were generated less because they'd be an acceptable target to the elves than because Tony was deeply annoyed with Asgardian intransigence. Then some idiot tried to bespell Tony. Leave it to that man to perform the impossible! The spell, as Loki had enacted it, was supposed to form a shield around the person and protect them from inimical spells. They would visibly flare when triggered, and that was supposed to be the end of it. So, of course, Tony somehow managed to go farther and somehow magically lash out in the direction of his would-be attacker. Tony was not magical. Loki knew this. Those capable of magic, even untrained, had a certain resonance to the senses of a trained mage. Tony had never had such a thing. So how in the name of all that was holy had he managed to change a spell set by himself? With no false modesty or pride, Loki knew himself to be quite powerful. Most mages would struggle just to end a spell enacted by himself. Changing it would be all but impossible. Changing a pre-existing spell called for a lot more energy than ending it, because you were changing the magic's purpose, not convincing its purpose was fulfilled. Magic wasn't sapient. It wasn't quite sentient either, but it had enough awareness, especially in the hands of an experienced wielder. Power levels had nothing to do with it, but knowing what you were doing most assuredly did, to be capable of doing things like discerning ill intent. Tony shouldn't be wholly incapable of doing anything, magically speaking, never mind this. But now that Loki was paying close attention, his occasionally damnable curiosity at work, he realized there was something about Tony. He could only assume that the situation being what it was, he'd been too distracted to notice, which was nearly criminal, because there was magic emanating from Tony, just not the resonance of a would-be magical. It was something vaguely familiar and centered in Tony's chest. And then the light turned on for Loki. Oh, the arc reactor! Barton had mentioned during his unwilling debrief as a mind-controlled minion, Loki was going to have to do something about making amends there, that Tony had changed how the arc reactor worked at some point. Something about something his father had discovered. Barton had not had details, just the pieced together bits of overheard gossip combined with known events. At any rate, whatever ran Tony's arc reactor had something to do with something his father had been working on. His father, who had worked with Stephen, both of whom had had contact either with the Tesseract itself or with the energy it produced. And the Tesseract, as were all the Kingmakers and power items, was highly magical. It was therefore not beyond the realm of possibility that Tony's father had somehow discovered a way to synthesize magic, or something close enough to it to work very much like it, at any rate. Perhaps his decision to use blue-white as Tony's fake magical signature in reference to the arc reactor had been more appropriate than he'd first thought. It did not completely answer for how the spell had been thrown back at its caster, but it was enough of a theory to be going on with. Loki fully intended to investigate the phenomenon properly later, but not much later. If there were going to be odd and unpredictable effects to magical spells around Tony, he needed to know what those would be as soon as possible. As startling as the incident had been, it did have the effect of garnering Salar's full attention. Pathetically predictable, but useful. Especially since Tony noticed and instantly started taking full advantage. After that last little comment, Tony gave Salar a toothy grin. So, what say we get down to business, shall we? I think you and I have all sorts of things to talk about. Salar corked an eyebrow at Tony, apparently finally on enough of an even keel to respond to Tony's assault. You seem under the misapprehension that you have anything to offer us as allies. Tony barked a laugh. You think I want your arrogant ass as an ally, Sal? No, not hardly. You lot think magic is the answer to everything, which makes you stupid as hell in my books. But if you're so sure you can hold off Thanos and tens of millions of Chitauri all by your lonesome, be my guest. And there, Tony had Salar over a barrel. And they both knew it. The elves had absolutely no hope of standing against Thanos if the rest of the realms fell. It was either throw their lot in with everyone else and hope it would be enough, or do nothing and the odds of dying shot a good deal higher. So, we don't have to like each other at all, but the whole not dying thing means we deal with each other, which means you getting the hell over yourselves. Tony pointed a finger at Salar. When this is over, you can come home and pout about how mean we all were and how rude it was that we didn't recognize your epic pretty princess-ness.